All right. Hello, everyone. A huge thank you for joining us today for a discussion on Fail Fast, Learn Faster, Real Lessons from Failed Software Releases. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Split by Harness. The webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the lead dev Slack to answer some of your questions in the hashtag continuous learning channel. We may also have time to answer a couple of questions live, so please do submit those via the Q&A feature on Zoom. We may answer them in line towards the end or in Slack after the fact. But first, let's get started with some introductions. My name is Lima, and today I'm joined by Rin, PA, and Muriella, who will kindly be sharing their experiences and insights. I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves. Want to start with Rin?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Rin. I'm dialing in from Helsinki this evening. I'm the tech lead of the cloud platform team at Mapbox, and I am really excited to be here. Love talking about incidents. Over to you, Marella.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mirella Batista. I am in New Jersey. I'm a self-taught software engineer with over 25 years of experience. Currently, I'm an STSM, that's the senior technical staff member at IBM. My focus is developer advocacy, and in our organization, the software and developer organization, we focus on supporting the software and platforms leveraged by our 250,000 worldwide fellow IBM employees. Over to you, PA.
Thank you. I'm PA. I'm in California, in the Bay Area. I'm part of the Split team that joined Harness a few months ago. I'm the VP of engineering here, and I've been spending a lot of my career focusing on engineering efficiency and transformation, digital transformation for teams and tools and all those related items, which make me a good fit, I guess, here at Harness.
Definitely. Thanks for the intros. So let's jump right into it. I'll start with a bit of framing. So pushing code to production is the outcome we all aim for, right? But as we all know, it doesn't always go as planned. Today, we're going to dive into the challenges that often lead to failed releases. Our panelists will share their experiences, highlighting the root causes, and offer practical insights on how to improve the art of pushing code to production. So let's get started. What's the most surprising thing you've learned from a failed release that you didn't expect to be important? Morella?
Oh my gosh, I love this question. I love, to be able to answer first, I have to share a horror story. I was at a financial institution, and I'm going to talk, of course, about a failed release. I was leading a UI team, and we were part of a big multi-team release. This happened a few years ago at the start of the pandemic, so you can imagine our mindset. Our development team had been working nonstop to provide self-service tools to our customers because our call centers, this was a financial institution, like I said, our call centers were being shut down because of COVID. So here we are, releasing a feature that would permit certain customers' accounts to apply for a type of debt relief, which was really, really important at the time. And we started with high hopes on a Friday morning. And eventually, after several rollbacks, finished our release on a Sunday afternoon. So as Friday turned into Saturday and Saturday turned into Sunday, the wear and tear on the team just became so evident. And if you've been in that type of situation, the nightmare that I'm talking about. There were several teams involved. There was a lot of people on those phone calls, backend, QA, UI, the release team. We were all remote, dealing with our pandemic experiences. The application was a monolith, highly coupled code, lots of customer PI involved, finance, and each release and rollback took hours. So once the fix was discovered, it was quickly, the problem was discovered, it was quickly fixed. But what was really surprised me about, what really stood out about this experience and why I love telling the story is because of how kind everyone was with each other during this release. I don't think we would have made it without the kindness and patience that was displayed throughout the process from the directors and the managers and technical leads and everybody on this phone call. In particular, one technical lead who was the calm in the middle of the storm. Without this gentleman and his amazing communication skills, he was like what everybody clung to, like he's going to get us through this. So technical leads like this gentleman are few and far in between, and these are people who should be highly valued. And that was like the one thing that really surprised me. It was how one person in an environment that was a positive environment in spite of really negative situations, one person really established a tone.
Mm, that makes sense. Yeah, that also sounds difficult while doing doing I can't believe rollbacks took hours. I don't know if I would have been as calm if a rollback took hours. That's a great story. Thank you for sharing. PA, do you have any experiences that you'd want to bring onto the table?
Um, I've had a few. I've had a
Yeah.
few. Um, the I'd say like some of the experience I've had, like most of them have been shorter than that. It sounds really long. I have one that was way longer than that, that went over months, but it's not a release. But I think like some of the challenges we've had is like one experience like that basically always comes up for me is when we try to roll things out and essentially like made we were using feature flags, which I still recommend to this day, but that was a poor implementation of our feature flags that was depending on the same database that was being affected by the changes. And so
Oh,
we turn it on and then we killed the database and we had no way to roll back because everything was on the floor. And that was a lot of manual work to basically revive the system and bring things back. And so that was also a lot of people coordinated, a lot of people involved in trying to figure things out, brainstorming ideas, because there is no plan for that.
right.
So
Right. You never think
that
about the feature flag failing. That's
yeah.
that's a nightmare.
And so that was a big experience too. But yeah, people staying calm helps. Though I don't think we were as calm as this gentleman sounded like from Mirla's story. Um, but at least nobody got really upset. So that was that.
Definitely. I'm going to move on to the second question. From your all's experiences, what are the most common causes of failed releases, whether it's technical, organizational, or process related? Rin, what do you think?
I feel like in my experience, it always comes down to kind of the cultural, the process, the organizational stuff underneath. Like, sure, we all work with computers, and the computers are going to do unexpected things sometimes at scale, and we have to deal with that. But ultimately, I think it always comes down to the people side of things. You know, we were rushing to meet a deadline, or we were overstaffed, or nobody knew that particular system because there was a lot of turnover and it had always just worked up until the day that it didn't. So I think we have to look beyond just the technical when we're looking for the things that are really going wrong that we need to change in the future.
Definitely. PA, do you have any thoughts here?
Um, yeah, I think like when we go through those kind of analysis, so I mean we should go probably through some of the typical technical or technical elements. But as Rin said, it's really like at the end underneath there's often first a second layer of process and then a third layer of culture and
Yep.
habits. And so and that's often like that was difficult to get to.
Mhm.
Like on the technical side, some of the things that like come often, it's like we rush steps, we skip some testing, we just go a little faster than we needed to because, well, maybe leadership is putting pressure. That might be the cause of a numerous incident. I should take responsibility. I think like some of the things I see also sometimes is the business owners, the product managers, or those people are not as involved as probably they should be in the validation. They're very involved in the definition, but not necessarily in the validation. And we know that translation, verbal translation and verbal, like what you say and what people hear, there's always a gap. And so there's like always things that are lost in the process. And there's a lot of details also that get, overlooked. And until
Yeah.
you really get into the trenches and you kind of miss those things. So I think like those are two things. And then after that, I have like in my list things that are more like on the technical side. I think like Mirala talked about the monolith, like when you have a lot of dependencies, when you have a lot of complex dependencies, whether it's in the monolith or between services, then you always have unintended consequences that can pop up at any time. So that often can happen. Rin mentioned, scale issues. Those are often difficult to really fully anticipate and manage. And then I think like the last category that comes to mind for me is like unplanned change impact. It's like, almost the feature flag story I was saying earlier, or like things that I've seen is like you restart a service and now you have connection swarm to the database. And then you didn't think of that because really you never basically get in that situation. But when you have like, I don't know, 1,000 services instances that are restarting and connecting to the database all at once, and then you make it go down because it's not really expecting that. So those
Right.
are kind of the categories that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, there's a lot of details that you said that I think are that we could all relate to. Like I think everything that you just said, we've all probably experienced pushing code to production. Morella, is there something that you would like to add?
Oh, I second everything they said. I mean, culture, when you have a blame culture, everybody that makes a mistake will hide their mistake as opposed to coming forward and saying, I made a mistake and this is probably why this is failing. So I want to underline culture and making sure that we make our people comfortable with saying, hey, I made a mistake. I also want to say a shout out to PA Sure. It is so appropriate for what we're talking today.
It's
I
very
saw
on
it this
brand.
morning in my drawer. I couldn't resist. I was like, oh, this got to be, this got
Awesome.
to be it.
What a release. It would be funny to have something underneath be like, what? It's easy, right? Because it's definitely like not easy. It's so complex. There's so many factors that come into play when pushing code to production. And it requires like so much thoughtfulness and detail oriented, but then also like being okay with the risk. And then like how do you like protect yourself from like the biggest risks? I think is when I think of releases, it's what I think. It's like sometimes it's okay if it goes wrong as long as you have like a clean rollback strategy that ideally doesn't take hours, or and you have the right folks taking accountability. I'm going to jump to our next question. As people leaders, what do you do during a release incident while it's quote unquote on fire? PA, we would start with you.
Um, I said like it varies very much depending on the culture of the team and where you are. The
Mhm.
teams I work with, the culture I try to push for is a culture of ownership.
Yep.
And so then in that context, I let them take the lead. I'm
Mhm.
here, I'm in the background, offer support, but they're in charge and know that they know the details way more than I would anyway. And
Mhm.
so I focus more on making sure that they're making progress, they're not
Yep.
disorganized. And then I basically help by maybe looking at a broader picture. Often, people look at the alert that triggered, and then they forget looking at, are other services working still, or is it a broader issue? So I
Mhm.
help on those things. Those things I help on communication. That's often the one thing that drops very quickly for technical folks. It's hard to remember, hey, you need to to talk to customer success to let them know what's happening so they can talk to customers and so on and so forth. Um, and then if things really get awry and the teams can't find some ways to be organized effectively, then I might step in, but that's the last resort.
Yeah, kind of like an incident manager to some
Yeah,
extent.
I might step in the incident manager, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to every manager because
Right.
I don't think it's a skill set that every manager has.
No, it's hard. No, that's so
It's
true.
very
And there's
specific.
There are like different degrees of incident manager. There's ones that get like really technical and into the weeds, and there are ones that just like protect the team so they can focus on like
Yeah.
figuring out the incident. Yeah, absolutely.
I want to second what he said about communication. Communication, you're going to have a lot of eyes on a release, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of people higher up the food chain on this release. And the more you communicate with them, the more proactive you are and tell them, this is what we know, this is what we're doing, this is how long we expect. That will buy you time, will create a bubble around your team so that your people can focus on the thing
Right.
that you need to solve. So I'm
Right.
glad that he brought that up, that PA brought that up.
Yeah, it's kind of like the
Yeah, I want to third that because yeah, communication is so critical. Like I've been on call for systems for 15 mumble years, and I've responded to a lot of incidents, and I think you cannot over communicate. Like when you're on the ground trying to, figure out what's going on, tell people what you're doing. Like, oh, I'm looking at this graph, I'm looking at this dashboard, I'm looking at these logs. Because a lot of times people will get really heads down trying to troubleshoot something, and they'll just go silent. And then,
worst. That's so
the customer
scary.
success people, the executives, everyone's wondering like, what's happening? Like, are you looking at it? Did you fall asleep because it's 2 a.m? So yeah,
Right.
definitely err on the side of over communication there.
Yeah, absolutely. As a leader myself, anytime again it gets radio silence, like I get like legit anxiety. It's like I don't know what's happening. So yeah, even just like I'm looking at this graph for a while would like makes such a big difference because then I have enough information to push back on like the folks above me to say like they're looking at stuff right now. And you don't have to provide them that detail, but you can at least have confidence that something's in progress without potentially just saying it without knowing it's in progress. Oh, communication, it matters. All right, I'm gonna go to the next question. As it's kind of similar. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna skip that one because we've kind of emphasized this already. Let's jump into incidents. Speaking of incidents, how do you run postmortems effectively? Rin, would you like to start us off?
Oh, I've got opinions on this. I think obviously we want to start by having our postmortems be blameless. Marilla, like you said earlier, when you have, a blame culture, people are gonna stay silent. People are gonna just like clam up. And you're never gonna find out what actually happened and what people were thinking if people are scared that they're gonna get fired for making a mistake. So trying to, have that culture of blamelessness where the goal is learning and understanding. And then I think the other thing, kind of like I mentioned earlier, is looking beyond the technical. Like a lot of people will do like the 5 whys as a postmortem, and they'll stop at 5. And I found that oftentimes that's just scratching the surface. You really have to, go deeper. I think John Allspaw called it the infinite hows. So don't ask why something happened, but how did this happen? Like, what were the circumstances? What was the decision-making process? How were people communicating? How did everything come together to lead to the outcome that it did? And then just keep asking that until you get to the, fun, nitty-gritty cultural organizational stuff.
I love that. I learned something new. I usually run the 5 whys. I've never thought of it from the hows. Thanks for that insight.
Oh, totally awesome. I'd never thought about that. And one thing that I wanted to add is sometimes not everybody is on the same page of, blamelessness. So reminding folks we're here to look at how things happen. I think I'm going to say how from now on. I love it. How things happen and how these things can be improved in the future. We're just reminding people so that everybody gets on the same page.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I didn't think of the how either, and I feel like really dumb that I didn't because I feel like it's so obvious when you say it. So thank you, Rin. The other thing with postmortem, I think like you have the postmortem of the incident, but if you have like regular incidents with relatively similar patterns, I think like that's when leadership needs to do their own kind of level of postmortem on like, hey, how is that happening? What is the process, the culture that we're setting that enables those things from recurringly happening? And I think that's often the thing that we are not very good at thinking about because the postmortem is so focused on the actual incident. And then we basically often stop short of taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture. Not something we want to do on every incident, but if it's starting to happen too regularly, like we definitely need to do that.
Out of curiosity, how do you all even just ensure that a postmortem happens? Have you ever, I feel like it's something that's sometimes skipped, unfortunately. Is there just like a secret tactic that you all have to make sure that the postmortem actually happens?
Yeah, you have to just make it happen. And some
Okay.
organizations that have never even heard of one, um, make it part of your practice. Make it an expected practice. We do retros, right? We do sprint retros. So this is basically a type of retro. And sometimes it takes one person to really just set the pace and set the guidance on this is healthy for my
Mhm.
team, for my culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Is there like an element of timing too? Like does a postmortem or incident retro, does it have to happen like a couple of days after the incident was resolved, a week? Because the thing that I sometimes struggle with is I want to do it like very soon, but I also want to give the team space to like take a breather. So I don't really know what the right balance is. What do you all think?
I think you got to do it within a week while it's still fresh in everyone's minds. Like, yeah, like you said, definitely give people a breather. Like you don't do it like, okay, everything's back up. We just put the status page back to green. Everyone go to the debrief right now. Like let people get some sleep, take at least, a night to get everyone, refreshed. So they're able to, think through things with more energy, more clarity. But if you wait too long, yeah, people are going to forget what happened and what they were thinking at the time. And you really want to get into those thought patterns.
Okay. That's good feedback, or that's good recommendation. My last question, and then we'll go to our next one, just because this is so relevant, at least, well, it's so relevant to releasing software. For incidents, like, do you advise the incident actually be facilitated by like an incident manager or a lead, an EM, or would it be like an engineer that was on the ground, like figuring out the resolution? Like, who should run the actual incident? Is that an uninformed question?
I think it depends of the incident to a degree.
Okay. Okay, so
Um,
cool.
like often for us, the engineers would be on call. So they would be the first one that would basically be there responding. And so as such, by default, you're the responder, you're the incident manager to start with.
I see.
So what's important is to basically help them being incident manager. So we do training so that people basically get a practical exercise to basically go through the steps. We experimented with some tools. We had a tool that was called Transposit. They actually got acquired by Harness, so hopefully it comes to life again. But that allowed to basically write kind of semi-automated runbooks and
That's
like
probably
guided
really
steps.
helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful for people because you get so narrow-sighted
Right.
when something
Those
happens.
artifacts would make a big
Yeah,
difference.
and so it's really helpful in basically going through sequencing. It's like I feel for me it's like being a pilot in an airplane. Not that I'm one, but you have your checklist, all the things you have to do, and sometimes you feel like you need to rush to basically I just want to take off, but if
Yeah.
you don't check your engine and everything else, then like it probably would not be a great idea. And
Yeah.
so helping people through that, I think is helpful. If it becomes too big and you have a company that has an incident manager or a NOC or somebody like that, then maybe you have somebody that takes point very quickly from there. Otherwise, it might be, the manager or somebody else, but they also need to have the training.
Right.
Otherwise, it's just going to add noise to the story.
Yeah, training is really important. When I was at Etsy, there was postmortem facilitation training that anyone could take. And one thing that they did there is oftentimes the facilitator was somebody who wasn't involved in the incident at
Right.
all. And the reason that I like that is because they will ask questions that somebody who is on the team who has all of that context in their head wouldn't ask. Like they will ask the questions so like, this might be obvious, like this might be a silly question, but like, tell me what you were thinking here. And that can trigger a lot of these aha moments that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were having a facilitator be someone on the team who was, you know, neck deep in all of the same context. So getting a kind of outside perspective as a facilitator can be really valuable.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a practice we do at Spotify too. So I resonate with that. But sometimes I feel like there's a lot of overhead with getting the external folks. So it's why I was wondering what you all do. I'm going to jump to the next question. Thank you for humoring me with those. Okay, so let's see. In the context of software releases, what tools or processes do you rely on to ensure smooth deployment, monitoring, and rollback if needed? PA, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, happy to. I feel like that's kind of what I'm specialized in nowadays. I think it essentially you look at every step of your life cycle and you really need to think about how you decrease your risk every step. And then you want to be careful not to overdo it, because if you basically essentially spend 90% of your time decreasing your risk and 10% of adding value, then you probably have a balance issue. But like, you know, simple things of like, hey, when you're writing the code, you know, you're writing tests. So there's testing practices, you know, what do you put in unit tests? What do you put integration test, end-to-end test? And so balancing that, PR checks to enforce, you know, coverage or a certain, you know, elements of code changes that basically needs to be met. So that's kind of like providing kind of a floor behavior for everybody
Fine.
in how they do things. And I think that's very helpful. And then you know, the next thing for especially with Split, you know, is like feature flags. Even though I had a burning experience with it, is still tremendously helpful. And so any meaningful change for us has to go behind a feature flag. It basically gives us instantaneous rollback.
Yep.
That's so practical. It allows us to basically scale things up progressively. So we basically can see how that's going to basically behave. And it allows us to mitigate most of the challenges we can run into. And so that's where it really helps. And it allows us to do many more deployments, de-risk the deployments, and all of those things. And then after, it's a lot on the monitoring side. And so there is monitoring as APM, but that's great that you got to have it, obviously. There is also monitoring, like at a feature level, if you can do that, which is really practical. Like when you pair it with feature flags, and you can say, hey, for the population that has the thing on versus the one that have the thing off, hey, your performance is already like 20% lower. APMs struggle with that, but if you have like systems that basically allows you to do those kind of analysis, then you start getting signals way earlier and being able to avoid to get in the hot water. And then the last thing I would mention is mentoring habits. It's like that, you know, you can't enforce everything through process. You have to basically give the direction with the process, but then after that is like having strong senior people that basically bring good habits and teach everybody else to do it. I think that's the fundamental of the piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I want to second feature flags. Feature flags are when you're dealing with complex releases with lots of traffic and you're diverting traffic from one cluster to the other, being able to have that feature flag access to your production release. But also something that's helped us is just maintaining a log of all the actions that are first a plan before you go into the release of step by step, even if it's a silly step, also a log during the release of what has been happening, especially if it turns into an incident. So you're not trying the same thing over and over again because you forgot that you did it a couple of days ago.
Yep.
It's been helpful for us.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I can think. Go ahead, Rin. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I absolutely agree with that, especially when you're on like the infra side of things, because with infrastructure changes, you can't necessarily put everything behind a feature flag. So having a very clearly communicated plan of like, how are you going to do the rollout? How are you going to verify that it is working? How will you know if it isn't working? What would the rollback plan look like? Like document all of that so well that if, you know, the person who's planning to be in charge of the rollout, you know, gets hit by a bus, up your bus factor, could somebody else pick up that plan and run with the deployment? Because you don't want to have all of that really important context just in somebody's head.
Absolutely. It's like we're thinking the same thing. I was thinking from a platform perspective. Sometimes feature flags, like it's just a multiple day rollout, and having that clear plan of where you are makes a big difference. I'm going to go a bit off script because this is very relatable. If to this conversation, let's say you're at a company that, or an engineering organization that struggles with releases, in the sense that a lot of incidents have happened in the past and you don't know how to like wrangle this and be in a more healthy state. What would you have them prioritize? Would it be better process or would it be feature flags? And those are the only two options. What would you pick and why?
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Because I mean, the process is about the people and the people knowing what to do, when to do it. But feature flags should be part of development. We should be
Right.
developing anything new so that we can do continuous integration. We should be developing behind feature flags. So, I mean, it looks if they didn't have either, the organization needs to learn to use feature flags in development, and fix their process, both of them at the same time.
Both of them
I
at the
can't
same
choose.
time. Okay, you can't pick. Okay, both of them at the same time. Because sometimes process changes when it comes from like a rollout or launch perspective. Sometimes it comes from the engineers. So let's say like you have like minimum capacity to make it better, and you had to like have like your staff engineer focus on one of those two. But you're right, like in those could be separate people, and those things could probably happen in tangent. PA, Ren, do you have a perspective?
Yeah, I can. I mean, Bryn might want to go first. No, I'll go. I mean, my first reaction was, well, feature flag is part of the process.
Sure.
Um,
Mhm.
so that was that. But reading a little further, probably what you had in your question, of like, hey, should we basically work on the deployment process and maybe the testing process versus feature flag?
Mhm.
Uh, and yes, ideally you would do both. Uh,
Mhm.
I say if you're on fire, maybe, of course, I'm going to sound slightly biased, but maybe I pick feature flag because it isolates the problems and it
Yeah.
de-risk a lot of the things. And it's very hard to basically up-level your testing all at once.
Yep.
And so it gives you room and some breathing room so that you can basically start making better investment in your testing.
I totally
Um,
agree.
so that's basically how I think I would approach it. After that, of course, depending on circumstances and everything might change. But
I like lived this example. I lived it. And so ironically, we did prioritize feature flags because it makes such a big difference. Like it makes you sleep better at night, knowing that you can just easily roll back this change. Even if your process for deployments is so messy, at least you know that you can like flip the switch very easily. Thank you for that off the script question. I'm going to keep going. I think we have some time still. Once you have the postmortem, how do you follow up on those action items? Morella, what do you think?
Many thoughts on this. No, really. There are a few basic actions I recommend, that following up on these action items, the least thing you want to do is, go through this exercise with folks and then things get lost, right? So write things down,
Mhm.
prioritize, evaluate, what's the low-hanging fruit that we can go after right now and immediately have a marked impact on our processes. Assign ownership. Because if things don't have ownership, it's like, well, who's going to do it? Well, we didn't assign ownership to this. And be very, very transparent. You've had an incident. People are looking at your team. Be transparent as to what you're doing after your incident and create accountability. So a little bit of discipline goes into this. Assigning ownership, and turning those action items into Jira tickets if you're using Jira. Making sure that everything has an assigned priority, like I said, and it makes it into the backlog and not at the very, very bottom of the backlog. You got to look at this, we don't want the technical debt to be at the bottom of our backlogs. It should not live there. So making sure this information is not sitting in someone's head, but the action items have been captured. And so there's a practice in terms of accountability at IBM. We hold a learning from incident sessions where these sessions are attended by leadership, very well attended by the executives and leaderships. And during the session, the incident timeline is discussed as well as the lessons learned and the actions taken. So knowing that you're going into a learning from incident session really puts that accountability on your team of not just build that backlog of action items, but do something with them so that you can report that you've done something.
Yep. Yeah, do things, tell people. Definitely.
Yeah. A lot of times I've worked at places that have said some sort of policy around like all remediation items that come out of a postmortem have to have a deadline of 30 days. Like you don't get to put it in the bottom of the backlog where it goes to rot forever. Like if it was important enough to come out of a postmortem, it's getting done in like the next, 1 or 2 releases, depending on, how long your release cycle is, because that's when it's still going to be, fresh, when people are going to have the context for why it's important. And that's how you kind of break the cycle of, oh yeah, like we've had this exact incident before and we just haven't gotten around to prioritizing the fix, like the patterns, I think, that we were talking about earlier. So putting deadlines in place, to kind of break those patterns.
TTLs, like your action items have TTLs.
One
I like
thing, yeah, one thing we do also is like in the postmortem, trying to separate a little bit short-term remediation from the longer-term ones, because that's where it gets muddy. If you put everything in there and everything has a TTL that's like 30 days, it gets difficult. But you have deeper, bigger projects that probably would alleviate the root issue. Like we have caching problems. Hey, we need to change our caching architecture. Well, that's not going to happen overnight. And that's essentially a project that leadership needs to prioritize, because at that point, it's basically conflicting with the roadmap. And so we have 2 big categories for the remediations, like all the short-term ones, which is about, hey, how can you catch it before it happens? How can you detect it faster? And how do you solve it in the first place? And then it's the long-term ones. What are the long-term projects? The team thinks, sorry, that addresses what is a deeper issue underneath. And so that really helps basically bubbling that up to leadership. And then we make every postmortem published to the whole engineering team and the leadership team. And so that keeps bringing them up. When you see the same thing 2-3 times about, hey, the caching architecture is broken. And at some point, we have to take some ownership as leader of like, hey, okay, we need to prioritize that. Also, it makes it easier for me to go to the, head of product and say, hey, I know you have all those really fancy stuff you want us to build, but we also need to do that because it's really hurting.
Yeah, no, definitely. I love all these best practices, from creating JIRA tickets or having your action items not live more than 30 days, or making the value proposition of why you should solve this clear, especially if you repeat it over time. I think these make a big difference. I think without it, it just becomes like lost in time. It kind of feels like, well, why are we doing the incidents essentially? So these are really great. We have one last question. What's one thing people should change in order to make their future releases better? Rin, we'll start with you.
I think I would say err on the side of over planning and over communicating. Like have a plan, communicate what you're doing, whether the release goes well or it goes poorly. Because I've seen a lot of people say, oh, I wish we'd taken a little more time. I wish we'd, thought out that testing better. I wish we'd, made sure that the staging environment matched prod. I've never seen anyone say, I wish we had just YOLO'd that release a little more. Just like 5 p.m. on a Friday, let's do it. We should do that next time. So communication, planning, rigor.
Yes, I agree with all of those. Those are going to help the leadership knowing that you are doing those, that you have the communication, the planning. It's going to build that bubble around you and your team. There's going to be more trust because as a people leader, while you're leading this release, you have to protect your people and keep your morale high, keep your people's morale high so that it does. So those are basic tools that help you create the space so that you can take care of people. So thanks, Rin, for that. Yeah.
Well said, Marilla. PA?
I'm like wondering if I go slightly controversial. Like I totally agree with what you said, Rin. But sometimes I also see like people stuck like in front of the risk and the release. They like, yeah, like they know it's a big change. It could basically have some severe impact. They basically plan this thing over and over. It's detailed and they have a lot of it. But at some point you need to jump.
Yep.
So it's not YOLOing, but you need to jump, Overthinking it at some point is not adding any value. So for me, it's like the key thing is, how can you detect, like, the few things are essentially, how can you basically have decreased your risk as best as you can, but not overdo it? And then how can you detect a problem really fast and being able to correct it really fast? It's like, I don't, and my customers might struggle a little bit with that. I don't necessarily aim for zero problems. I aim for very small problems.
A small
And so
black.
that's how I think of it. Of like, hey, how do we detect really fast, fix it very fast? Let's not YOLO. We still write tests. We still do all those things, obviously. We don't gamble the house unnecessarily. But let's not hold too long and be slow unnecessarily.
That's
Because
a
at the
really
end,
good point. We don't want to reinvent waterfall. Like
Yeah,
exactly.
practice. If the more you practice your releases, the better you will get at your releases.
for sure. And the more seamless they'll be. This is also making me realize I should, instead of saying what would you improve if a company specifically is really struggling with the releases, whether it's a feature store or process changes, I should have said feature store or monitoring. That would be harder to pick from, I think, those two. All right. Thank you so much. I think this was really insightful. I really appreciate everyone joining today. We will be sending a follow-up email after this event, which will include some additional resources for Split by Harness, a guide to feature rollout best practices, product information sheet, and customer case study, which sounds super insightful. Check those out. Again, thank you for joining us today at today's panel. We'll all be heading over now to Lead Dev Slack in the #continuous learning channel. Please head there to continue the discussion. And yeah, thank you for joining us.